All right, taking you now to Geneva, where Russian President Vladimir Putin has actually been speaking to reporters after meeting with President Joe Biden. There you see the limousine of the President of the United States that is on its way departing the meeting, which sort of ended a little earlier than expected, Anne-Marie. It was expected that at one point we thought that the meeting was going to go on for about 4 hours. But it seems to have ended fairly quickly. There were two separate meetings. One was a one-on-one meeting with the President of the United States and Vladimir Putin, and then there was a bilateral meeting with Vladimir Putin, the President of the United States, along with the Secretary of State and the Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. But it appears now that both of those meetings have ended. The President of the United States is on his way, where he will soon hold a news conference with reporters. Believe that Russian President Vladimir Putin will also be speaking to the Russian members of the press that is traveling with them. So we will see what has come of it and what we will have learned, what the president would have learned after that meeting with President Putin. There was a lot to talk about. Seems that they wrapped it up a little earlier than expected.
Yeah. A little earlier than expected. I don't think either of them have spoken to any members of the media yet, but as you pointed out, that'll be happening a little bit later. President Biden is waiting until after President Putin speaks to the media before he will disclose what they discussed, whatever it is. The first, you mentioned that there's sort of a two-parter for the meeting. The first one lasted an hour and a half, and I believe the second one just lasted an hour with more people there, which is sort of surprising because yeah, there was a lot on the table. Certainly the cyber attacks that many of them, at least our intelligence community believes many of them have come out of Russia. Whether they're sanctioned or not is sort of a whole other story, but certainly they're Russian-based hackers. Human rights issues. Alexei Navalny is most likely to come up. Also the issue of a prisoner exchange. There are 2 Americans being held in Russia right now on a couple of charges. One facing an espionage charge. The other one, I believe, sort of like a drunken brawl charge. You know, both of them say that they are innocent of the charges, and certainly their loved ones would like to see them come home and would like to see President Biden, you know, discuss the possibility of them being released or some sort of swap. So we'll see. I'm sort of surprised that they had gone such a short period of time. Earlier today, Vlad, you know, Ed O'Keefe felt like they would be talking much longer, and particularly when you consider that, you know, people speak and then there's got to be a translator who's got to, you know, repeat exactly what was said. So you would think that these sort of meetings would take a long time. But, you know, we've been told to have low expectations, that we weren't going to see any concrete agreements happen, that that this is more sort of an opening act or an appetizer that hopefully will result in further talks. And more than anything, we know when we were talking earlier on CBSN, the general feeling was that the hope is that out of this will come some sort of bright red lines, that both parties will understand the boundaries of this new type of relationship, so they know not to cross it. And the idea is to have a stable relationship, a predictable relationship, and hopefully the next step is to have a better one, because right now it's kind of bad.
Yeah, we showed you a picture that flashed on the screen just while you were speaking there, Anne-Marie. That was actually tweeted by the Russian Foreign Ministry, and it shows the bilateral meeting there between the President of the United States and Russian President Vladimir Putin, along with their respective advisors. So that's really the only image that we have from within the meeting. Yeah, you know, I know that this is an important meeting. It's an important meeting for the President of the United States and certainly for Russian President Vladimir Putin. You know, I suspect that the pomp and circumstance that surrounds these things, generally you learn a lot more from, you know, the breakdown of what people expect and what the pertinent issues are as they come to the forefront, to remind the American people, as you did, Anne-Marie, of the things that are important to the United States interests, like, for example, those prisoners, the hackings that have occurred over the past years, the disinformation campaign, the meddling in our elections, et cetera. But I suspect that, as was pointed out by also Ed O'Keefe and Nancy Cordes, that this is not Yalta, the Yalta Conference that occurred back in 1945 when the United States, Russia, and Britain sat down and actually came up with a plan that changed the face of the world, right? These are meetings that people have between each other that they spend quite a bit of time talking about the things that are really pertinent, and then it's over. And so I'm actually not surprised that it lasted, that it was as short as it was. What was remarkable to me was perhaps the meeting that former President Trump had with Vladimir Putin. That meeting, where there were no other individuals present, is the one that we will never really know what happened there, because it appears that the Biden administration is not even pursuing any of the details from that Helsinki meeting. So this one, we'll probably learn from the president what was discussed. And I suspect that nothing, as you say, will have been decided. It will just have been a discussion.
Yeah, but there are at least some areas where there is a little bit of common ground when it comes to arms control. The Iran nuclear deal is another area that maybe they may be able to move forward with. But we'll see. The rest of the world is watching. Ukraine is watching nervously. President Biden said that all the meetings sort of leading up to this, the G7, NATO, meeting with EU leaders, have prepared him for the meeting with President Putin. But there's kind of like another flip side to this too, as well. And we talked about this earlier, that sort of starting with a series of meetings, high-profile meetings with world leaders, and then kind of ending, if you will, putting a period at the end of the sentence with Vladimir Putin, kind of puts him on the same level as these other world leaders. So no matter what comes out of this meeting, it's sort of a win for Vladimir Putin. For President Biden, he says, essentially, like I said before, what they want is a stable, predictable relationship. There's a whole lot of stuff that President Biden would like to take care of here at home domestically. A lot of his initiatives are kind of hitting a bumpy patch now that he's away. And he would like not to have to deal with the distraction of an unpredictable, assertive Russia. So if they can kind of draw some lines in the sand, then I'm sure the president would prefer to focus on domestic issues as this country emerges from a pandemic.